Hi, everyone. Eve Harow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. It's Sunday, December 24th, 2023, the 13th day of Tevet, 5784. Recording this a couple days early because I have a very busy week. Solidarity mission coming in for One Israel Fund. We're going to be all over the place. But I didn't want to disappoint my listeners and leave you without me for the week. So, but not just anyone that I'm interviewing. I'm talking to Dr. Stephen Herman, who also happens to be a friend. But in addition to that, senior thoracic surgeon, let's see if I get all these right, at Maimonides Medical Center, the associate professor of surgery at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, New York, associate professor at SUNY Downstate University, and a couple more. What I wanted to talk to Steve about, and what I wanted you guys to hear about, was he was in Israel a couple of months ago, and he was practicing medicine here during the war, and on soldiers and on others. So, Steve, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Eve.
So, Ashkelon, the war breaks out, obviously, October 7th. And you were here, you came in. Well, what happened 11 weeks ago?
Well, 11 weeks ago, we knew on October 7th that something terrible was going to happen.
Right.
And I initially contacted a friend of mine, who was also somebody who I had trained while I was at Mount Sinai, who is now presently chief of thoracic surgery in Shaarei Tzedek in Jerusalem, Professor Dr. Danny Fink. And he had actually told me that right now everything was fine in Israel, that they don't really need any help because everything was solid. My wife and I we went over to Europe because we knew that if anything should change, that getting to Israel from America might be complicated. And so we actually went to Europe, and we were in Germany. And until finally a call did come from Danny through the Ministry of Health, that indeed there was a need for thoracic surgeons, and that they were wondering whether I would be willing to come to Israel and be deployed to Ashkelon at the Barzilai Medical Center.
Now, you've been doing this for a while, right? You've had permission to, not everybody can just pick up and practice medicine in another country, right? So you've already had a license to practice in Israel, despite the fact living in America for a while?
Yes. What I was relatively unique, and that was why I think I was one of the first practicing surgeons to come over. As I mentioned, Dr. Fink was one of my trainees at Mount Sinai when he was learning his craft. And he came over to Israel and became a junior attending at Shaarei Tzedek. And then he had invited me a number of times, along with their leadership, to come as a visiting professor to Jerusalem. And then ultimately, after I'd come a few times, they thought it would be better even that if I were able to participate in surgeries with their junior faculty and residents, and that would enhance my abilities to teach them. And so Danny and Shaarei Tzedek worked with the Ministry of Health, and about 5 or 6 years ago, I was fully credentialed by the Ministry of Health to do surgery. And I've come over to Israel a few years before COVID. Obviously, COVID put a stop to for a short interregnum. And I operated at Shaarei Tzedek with the team for a number of years. And so I was fully credentialed already, which actually allowed me to come to Israel and function as a surgeon much quicker, because all the other people who were volunteering, and there were quite a number.
Yes.
There was a tremendous outcry and support from both American and foreign doctors who wanted to help Israel, but they needed to have their credentials vetted. And mine had already been, and so I was sort of ready to go from the get-go.
So for those who aren't familiar, thoracic surgery is what exactly?
It's surgery of the chest, which means everything that the chest includes. So that goes from the neck down to the upper abdomen. So it includes the heart, the major blood vessels in the chest, the lungs, the esophagus, the food pipe, the windpipe, and all the other structures that pass through the chest into the abdomen.
So in your regular practice, I mean, your mainstay is like someone who needs more or less scheduled or has like a heart problem, as opposed to what you're dealing with here in Israel, which is people who have been injured in a, it's not a health issue. It's the fact that some very blunt and very quick moving object struck them. Is that what happened here? Is that the difference?
Yes, we do a lot of elective surgeries like open heart surgery and things of that sort, cancer surgery on both the food pipe and on the lung cancer and things of that sort, and tumors
Right.
of the chest. But
Right.
also there are other issues that are more urgent, like trauma. We do see trauma in New York.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's becoming more and more common. Both
Mm-hmm.
although high velocity bullet injuries like coming from assault rifles are not that common. We see low velocity handguns. We see knife wounds occasionally. We
Mm-hmm.
also see other non-trauma inflicted emergencies, such as a ruptured food pipe or a collapsed lung. These
Right.
are all things that can be done by trauma, yet also can come naturally. So
Mm-hmm.
these things are all part of the actual process. And over my years as a practicing thoracic surgeon, I've dealt with all of these.
So when they ask you to, yeah, go ahead. So when they ask you to come to Israel, though, are they asking you to deal with what's happening with the war, meaning soldiers who are getting injured, or are they asking you to take over the things that are still happening to the regular population? People are still need lung surgery and all that, so that other surgeons can focus on, what's happening because of the war.
It's essentially where you are deployed.
Okay.
Israel does not have a military hospital system, as you know well. Here in America, we have civilian hospitals, we have military hospitals. Injured patients from wars will go to a military facility, and then transfer to a secondary or tertiary care military facility. So in a civilian hospital, like most of us practice in America, we don't really see military issues. In Israel, it's quite different. Being a different population, different size military, etc. It's the civilian hospitals that take care of the military injuries. So depending on where the actual war process or the injury occurs, or where the hospital is, you will see a different relationship. And for instance, in a hospital in Jerusalem, which is somewhat central, not near any of the borders where there is incursions, you're not going to see too many fresh war injuries, other
Mm-hmm.
than the terrorist attacks that occur on the
Right.
streets or whatever. However, in Barzilai in Ashkelon, we were the closest hospital to Gaza. We were
Right.
within 5 or 7 miles of the Gaza border. This was basically ground zero of all the rocket attacks. And this hospital, Barzilai, as well as Soroka and Beersheba, were the two main closest hospitals where all the injuries were deployed. So my job, when I first got there, was before the incursion. And so there were a few cases that needed to be done in the hospital,
Mm-hmm.
just for sick people, patients who had lung tumors, patients who had maybe a collection of fluid around the heart, which was preventing the heart from working well. These are
Okay.
all types of cases that I took care of with Dr. Ponomarenko, who was a thoracic surgeon at that hospital with whom I teamed.
Okay. So wait, this is before October 7th.
This was
You
before.
had already worked
This was
there.
after October
Oh,
7th.
after. Okay.
I arrived in Israel the last week or week and a half of October.
Okay.
The Gaza incursion did not occur until like
Right.
the last week of October, and then I
Mm-hmm.
stayed through early November.
Okay, so I want my listeners to understand. So on October 7th, we have a lot of the injured from the actual attack by Hamas. But then there are a few weeks where the army is calling in the reserves and they are getting ready to go into Gaza. And only then does the army actually go in. Okay. And by then you're here.
I was there after October 7th, but before the
Mm-hmm.
incursion.
Right.
So we had basically two phases or two types of experiences. The experience that I had initially was arrival. We had a few patients still hospitalized from the kibbutzim, and also some soldiers who were injured during the initial Hamas October 7th contact and the massacres.
Mm-hmm.
And I helped take care of some of these patients. I can discuss a few interesting cases as we
Okay.
go.
Yeah, if you can, obviously no names, but whatever you can talk about.
And then
Right.
and nothing identifying.
No.
And then we also were doing some relatively minor procedures because we never knew when the incursion would be and when we would be influxed with injured soldiers,
Mm-hmm.
and also there were constantly rockets flying around,
Right.
especially in that region, and you never knew when a mass casualty situation would occur, where you would need the ICU beds and emergency operating room. So all along major significant operations that would normally be done, big long cancer operations, heart surgery, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
were not done in most of all of the Israeli hospitals, and these were put on hold. And the only procedures were done were some of these life-saving or easy, quick procedures that did not require intensive care space and did not require long-term operating room time, so as to allow us to be ready to react to an emergency.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is sort of what we did. It was actually relatively quiet, as you could expect, because
Right.
luckily Iron Dome was very efficient. And although not for lack of the Hamas for trying, because the missiles were flying all multiple times a day,
Mm-hmm.
and this was the first time I had been under attack, and I sort of learned that was a new experience, both in my hotel at night after my shift, and also while I was in the hospital. We were the sirens were almost constant.
And I think it's half a minute. That's the only.
30 seconds, yes.
Yeah.
And actually,
Yeah.
they put me in a hotel, not in Ashkelon. Ashkelon was primarily evacuated, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was put into a hotel in Ashdod, which is about a 15-minute drive north of Ashkelon. And in Ashdod, at the hotel, we had 30 seconds. The Ashkelon was even sooner, 15 to
Right.
20 seconds was the Ashkelon time. So we didn't have much time. So you learned to move along and do your normal daily tasks relatively quickly because you didn't want to get caught during a siren in a situation where you couldn't get out to your shelter.
Right. Exactly. So, okay, the incursion starts and everything
So
changes.
then the incursion starts. And then actually, I remember very vividly, this is one of the most interesting things, is I used to come into the hospital, Dr. Ponomarenko, who was my a colleague there, who was an Israeli thoracic surgeon. Used to we were a team, we teamed up, and he would pick me up in my hotel. His living was also in this area, so he also drove into the hospital. It was very relatively convenient. So he would pick me up at about 6 a.m. every morning, and then we would come into the hospital. And then as we were coming into the hospital this day, we were alerted on our phones, which was all attuned to the hospital, that the incursion had begun, and we had casualties, and go straight to the emergency room to await. And
Mm-hmm.
this was something relatively unique because when I got there, we had essentially the entire hospital staff by the emergency room bay, awaiting awaiting the ambulances that were coming in with injured soldiers. And it was an incredible sight because something different than we have in America in the Israeli hospitals at these emergency things. Everybody's wearing a vest which labels their role, so you know exactly who is what: anesthesia, surgeon, thoracic surgeon, uh, uh, orthopedist, psychologist, a nurse, whatever. Everybody has a sign on their back, so everybody knows immediately who they are, what they are, and it actually organizes things much better. This is something I'm taking back to my system, and then there are many things that sometimes you learn,
Mm-hmm.
and then and the anticipation and the eagerness to help, which was on everybody's face, and as everybody as literally 100 150 people of the hospital staff were there waiting to take care of their injured brother whom they've never seen before, but who was their relative. It was a very moving scene. I took a photo, which I'm going to put up because this is one of the most memorable events of of my time there, was the waiting and the everybody as a team, as a family, to take care of our own.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll just compose myself for a second. It was a tough weekend here in Israel. We lost 15 soldiers. So, um, Okay, so they start coming in, and what kind of injuries are you seeing in the main, or all types?
Well, many of these injuries were penetrating injuries, which means things that shouldn't be in
Blew
your
up.
body got in or got through.
Mm-hmm.
And shrapnel was a major. These are from various explosives where little particles penetrate. They're like mini bullets. Some of them can be small, like your thumbnail, and another, or even smaller, and others can be quite large.
Mm-hmm.
Um, those were from various explosives that and that penetrate. We saw also, obviously, bullet wounds
Right.
coming from high-powered automatic weapons, AK-47s, things of that sort. Um, we saw um, blunt injuries. There was one particular fellow I remember, a tank commander who actually fell off his tank, and these are quite high. And he broke
Mm-hmm.
11 or so ribs,
Mm-hmm.
which is quite a
Wow.
devastating injury, plus other orthopedic injuries. So we saw fractures, and then bullet wounds that traverse other parts of the body. So these
Mm-hmm.
were most of the types of injuries that we saw.
So maybe a naive question. How, and I guess that's part of what the triage is, how do you decide what to work on first? I mean, you're the guy for the chest, but let's say they're coming in with a tourniquet because, the legs are bleeding profusely or whatever it is. A lot of injuries were to lower bodies. Are they doing surgery simultaneously, or does somebody make the decision that the heart injury, the chest injury is life threatening, the other thing can wait? What happens in these literally seconds or very few minutes when you're all there? You mentioned all these experts are there. How are these decisions made?
Well, it's usually the emergency room doctors are there making the initial decisions along with
Mm-hmm.
the specialties, depending on the injury itself.
Right.
And that is basically the art of triage, which means this deciding priorities and actually what the treatment is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Many times, just because you have a penetrating injury doesn't necessarily mean you have to go to the operating room.
Okay.
If patients are actually actively bleeding or have injuries or that require immediate cessation, I mean, those are priority ones.
Mm-hmm.
So and those would go first. Then there are those that are penetrating that have to be fixed, but perhaps, let's say, an abdominal wound where the bullet goes through intestine and makes holes and things of that sort, but it doesn't hit a structure that's carrying blood and you're not bleeding to death. Well,
Mm-hmm.
that is something that has to be fixed. The holes have to be closed, otherwise you're not going to survive. But that can wait. That can wait an hour, 45 minutes.
Right.
Yes, it's better to do it right away, but if you wait an hour or two while somebody's who's bleeding to death is fixed,
Right.
you're not going to be impacted so much. So
Mm-hmm.
that would have a sort of a lesser thing. And then there
W-
are others that won't require any operating room at all. But for instance, fractures or this or that, and
Right.
they would be set by their specialists in some other areas.
What is your opinion of the I mean, I assume you're mainly working with Israelis. There aren't that many volunteers such as yourself there at the time. Like, what can you tell us about? Unfortunately, they have so much experience now about the Israeli emergency room doctors and the other specialists that you've worked with.
Well, I think they are very calm and very incredibly competent, and they know
Mm-hmm.
what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And there, when I was there, there was one other an American anesthesiologist from the Five Towns who did some work with their anesthesia team, and then I was the only at the time the only uh, surgical, hands-on surgical person.
Mm-hmm.
And but everything worked very efficiently. We teamed up so that and we also had residents. Interesting, some of the residents were Israeli Arabs. One of the fellow who assisted me on a number of cases was a fellow by the name of Mohammed.
Mm-hmm.
And then just to let everybody know that Israeli citizens, whether they were Jewish, Christian,
Right.
or
Muslim, anyone.
Islam, they all
Mm-hmm.
worked together and they all worked as a team and as Israelis.
Mm-hmm. And the patients get the same treatment, of course,
And the patients get the same
without
treatment.
exception.
And there were patients in the hospital of all religions and of
Mm-hmm.
all of all things. This is another, when you come to America and you hear about Israeli apartheid, I mean, it's obviously from somebody who's who's never been there, has never seen the Israeli medical system or the Israeli social system in action, and they're morons, but
or wants to spread lies. Take your pick. Right.
or evil. I mean,
Right.
or both.
Mm-hmm.
So but that was the way it functioned and worked,
Mm-hmm.
and it was honestly for me an honor to be part of this, and it was an experience which I'll always remember.
So coming from a place of a Jewish mother, and I know you've been a physician for a very, very, very long time, and I'm sure have lost patients. But, as you said, they're coming in, it's a brother coming in, even though they've never met, right? Because that's how it is here in Israel. Every single soldier is maybe 2 degrees separated from each one of us, and could be our boys. So there had to have been situations where you couldn't save the soldiers. How the doctors just like put themselves somewhere else. They just deal with the situation, leave their emotions for another time, and just do the work at hand.
Well, I have to tell you this, with no small measure of pride, that during the 2 weeks 2.5 or so weeks when I was there,
Mm-hmm.
we did not lose one patient.
Wow.
Any patient who arrived to that hospital at Barzilai, probably
Mm-hmm.
due to the expertise of the overall staff.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't me. I'm talking about this
Right, right,
hospital,
right.
and because I was a very small cog in this,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but the we would and a patient reached the ER during my time. I can't say what happened after. I don't know
Right.
so much, but I do know that during my time we lost no one. So
Wow.
anybody who arrived to the hospital was
Mm-hmm.
able to be served. Now, with that said, that is life and death. That is not to say that some of these kids' lives had not been permanently altered and not to
Right.
the good.
Right.
Uh, for every soldier or every civilian that gets injured in one of these, uh, a larger number have injuries which may not be totally fixable.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they survive. For instance, we had one soldier who had multiple gunshot wounds, and one of them unfortunately hit a lower spinal cord.
Yes.
So yes, we were able to save his life. We were able to, prevent him bleeding to death and
Mm-hmm.
sew up all the holes in his belly, and everything's fine. But he's never going to walk again.
Right. We have quite a few, possibly
Uh,
in the thousands of soldiers who are now in wheelchairs, either whose one or both legs were blown off or who've been paralyzed. That's something that Israel's going to have to deal with on a very intensive level, already starting now, obviously, but after the war, because every one of those soldiers, of course, has a circle of family and of friends, and all of that, of course, changes. So right now we're in the middle of the war, and we talk about those who were killed, and there are funerals every single day. But as you just said, there are many people blinded also whose lives are really irrevocably changed. And yeah, so that's pretty amazing though that you were able to save so many lives. Do you have any particular stories, again, as we said, without any identifying features that you can share with us? Anything that stands out?
well, there was one when I first got there. As I said, we had a couple of people who were still hospitalized that were involved in the October 7. There was
Mm-hmm.
one soldier who was one of the early responders, um, to the massacre, who was there, and actually he was firing, or he was confronting some of the Hamas uh, perpetrators, and he was shot through his eye, and the bullet traversed down through his windpipe and his food pipe
Oh my
and
God.
through his chest. And so he had a complex injury. He obviously lost the eye, was not recoverable. He had some facial reconstruction done so that at least his face would look normal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That was actually quite, he was operated on, obviously, about a week and a half or two before I arrived, because that was when
Mm-hmm.
October 7th occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And we had done some work on getting his food pipe and his windpipe in order.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you had these multiple injuries, because bullets traverse and deflect and go in different directions. And this was a young fellow who who's luckily he will ultimately recover from his breathing and his feeding, but
Mm-hmm.
his eye is gone.
Right.
And the you know and the when the family visited and whatever, it was really a moving type of situation. And really, this was the first soldier that I had taken care of when I arrived,
Mm-hmm.
because like I said, there wasn't that much activity from that perspective going on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then the another one which I remember very clearly was I mentioned to you, if this fellow had fallen off the his
Right.
battle tank, and he was sort of like a high ranking uh, uh, person, and he was lying there, and obviously I think he fell off trying to avoid an RPG or some other type
Right.
of a soul that was targeting his vehicle. And at his bedside there was this a rabbinic looking person in a military uniform with a long beard, payas, yarmulke,
Right.
with full military garb. And I thought this was some sort of like a chaplain or visiting,
Mm-hmm.
the soldier. The soldier also was a was a from individual, had a knitted kippah.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out that this was actually his who I thought was the chaplain was actually his father,
Wow.
who was also I think a colonel, general, or some high ranking.
Mm-hmm.
Not he was not really a clergy at all, but a high ranking military combat soldier.
Wow.
A battalion or division or whatever. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
sure.
Mm-hmm.
Leader, and you see this, and these are the people that are fighting for us and with us. And it was a really a memorable time.
Yeah, we have quite a few fathers and sons fighting together there because of the miluim, what we call the reserve duty, and sometimes they find each other on the kesher, on the shortwave, or sometimes they just run into each other in the middle, or they know where they are, and some of the scenes that have been publicized are absolutely incredibly moving. What's also hasn't been publicized that much is how many, you mentioned high-ranking people, is how many officers have fallen, because in Israel, there's what's called acharai, after me. The officers aren't sitting in the back and sending the soldiers out. They are leading the soldiers into battle. And many of them are paying for that with their lives. It's almost, every day when we have a cluster of soldiers who were killed, it is very rare that one of them isn't an officer. And I think it says something very deep about the Israeli army. I'm not going to send you in to do something that I'm not doing myself.
And
And
that
it's,
that's
yeah,
that's
that spirit.
exactly true. Now, the other thing I wanted to bring up is where we stayed. I stayed in a hotel in Ashdod,
Right.
and the hotels, as you know, because of the war, hotels were relatively empty. There were no
Mm-hmm.
tourists in Israel. Everything people couldn't get, and the people didn't want to come because of all the
Right.
rockets and things. But in my hotel, there was, in addition to me, a bunch of people who were refugees, who were displaced, who were actually evacuated from Ashkelon, evacuated from the bordering uh, communities to Gaza, whose houses were destroyed by rockets, and who really it was no longer safe for them to stay there for future rockets, and so they were staying in these hotels, and they had essentially nothing with them. The hotel was putting them up. I think the government was paying small amounts for this,
Mm-hmm.
feeding them. I was eating with these people at night when I came home, and I tried to spend some time with them. But to see how little kids who are, who were going through this, and this was where what their life was really a very very heart moving situation.
Right. It's still going on. The hotels are still full of people, not just from around Gaza, but from the north, because that's
Exactly.
on a low level, but going to blow up at any minute situation. So there is a line up north, where everybody has pretty much been evacuated from those communities because the Hezbollah is shooting at them. So we have a lot of internally displaced refugees in the country. And right, the tourists aren't here, but the hotels are full of them. So, and I know from a tremendous outpouring, there are people who did stay in Ashkelon because I'm on an Ashkelon WhatsApp list, whom I know every single day were sending sandwiches and food to the Barzilai Hospital where you were working for the staff, understanding that the staff, such as yourself, weren't getting any sleep, were working like crazy, and not everything could be supplied. And so a lot of the people in the community were making sure that, that things, and I think they're still doing it up until this day. Wasn't the hospital itself hit a couple of
Yeah, that was what
times?
I was going to tell you. The
Mm-hmm.
hospital was held has when I got there, I learned a little bit about the hospital. And when I first got there, they took me around, and there's a sort of a corridor, and on that corridor, they had made a museum of the remnants of rockets that have hit the hospital over, since Hamas has been rocketing this over the last almost 8-9 years,
Right.
and you see a bunch of shells that have actually hit this hospital over the years.
Mm-hmm.
I, I have photos. In addition, the day before I hit the hospital, there was a hit, and I have a video actually that was given to me of the response to that hit, of it hitting the hospital and destroying parts of it,
Mm-hmm.
which led the hospital to evacuate their upper floors where their normal patients' floors are, where they have nice windows, views of the ocean and things, which are very helpful for patients to recover. They
Right.
were all moved to an underground uh, uh, basement patient ward, where certainly there are no windows. It's not such a pleasant for recovery, but it's much safer because if you get a rocket and you're in a bunker, you'll
Mm-hmm.
survive. And all the major functions of the hospital were moved from the upper floors to the lower ones. The operating rooms are concrete reinforced, so they were uh, essentially safe from bombs. But some of the other floors were not, and they were moved to a lower areas where they could be evacuated much more quickly. Like ICUs and things of that sort. So,
Mm-hmm.
and then and we had multiple sirens while I was there, where the hospital itself was targeted but was not hit. The hospital itself was hit maybe 7 or 8 times uh, uh, over the last few years, and a few times in the last few months. And it's interesting that when a Gazan hospital gets hit by a Gazan Hamas missile, that becomes
Right.
international condemnation of Israel. Yet I did not hear of any international organization describing Barzilai Hospital being hit by Hamas missiles, which is obviously a major war crime.
Yeah. And more than that, we have found out that the hospitals in Gaza, and there were 31, which is really a nice number of hospitals for one little area. So they're not as poor and devastated as people are going to make it out to be. But many of them were themselves bases for terror. A lot of the doctors were Hamas operatives. Tunnels underneath the hospitals. I mean, these certainly weren't just places where people went to get healed, but places where terrorists actually worked out of, as opposed to the Israeli hospitals who exist solely to help people heal and to save their lives. Every single hospital. And of course, most of the Israeli hospitals have unfortunately had to build underground versions of the hospitals because the enemy targets our hospitals. They target the civilian hospitals. And so, in order to continue saving lives, a lot of it has to go underground. I've been in quite a few hospitals in Israel where the parking lot, you go into the parking lot underground, but that parking lot can quickly turn into part of the hospital itself if it has to. And that's just the reality here. And I think it shows a tremendous difference between Israel and our neighbors on how we sanctify life, everybody's life, and how they sanctify death, and how they're doing what they can for no other reason than to destroy the Jewish state. And here you are, as someone who didn't have to be here, Steve, and you come in and you spend a few weeks doing this. So first of all, I want to express my appreciation for that. I've told you that off, off, off podcast, but I'll tell you that again. It's not, it's not, as they say in Hebrew, move on me'alav. It's not taken for granted that you would do that. And I know that there's other physicians who've done that as well. People have been in contact with me to ask how they could come. I'm sure after this podcast, other people will ask, is there still a need for foreign physicians, do you know, to come in and volunteer for a couple of weeks?
I think there is, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that it's specialty specific.
Okay.
They don't, certain specialties are not necessary. Other specialties are.
Right.
I'm going to be able to perhaps in February. I have to do a little work around here to justify my being at my hospital.
Right.
And my hospital, I just want to put a shout out to Maimonides. Is that my team and the hospital was very supportive of my being able to be absent and be in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And the Maimonides team actually assisted in procuring tourniquets, which medical surgical tourniquets, which are used as by first responders to stop bleeding on extremities, on arms
Right.
and legs, until they can be brought to the hospital. And those patients who have had, injuries to the with bleeding injuries, so that they
Mm-hmm.
don't bleed out before they're brought to the hospital. And our hospital was able to supply the first responders, I think primarily in the north, where they were needed to help that. So so I was actually very gratified that everybody was okay with me going and covering my absence. And
Right.
then hopefully maybe in February, if I'm needed, hopefully I won't be, but
Right.
this will all be over and
Mm-hmm.
Hamas will be eradicated. But if so, I'll come back if there's still a need.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Thank you so much. Any last words that you'd like to add?
No, I think we've covered pretty much most of everything.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I just think that the outcry of Jews around the world was actually very gratifying.
Right.
That we had here, but even when we have something good, the um, the emergence, particularly here in America, of the young and the universities in response to this was actually very chilling
Yes.
and revealing, and at least knows where our next battles here in diaspora have to be directed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I say that as an Israeli, we're kind of worried about you guys, but that's a different podcast on a different topic. Dr. Stephen Herman, thank you so much for coming here, for always being willing to step in, and because that's what our people do. We're there for each other in good times and bad. And right now is one of the bad times, but we'll get through this as well. So I just want to thank Tabitha and Ben for helping put the show out every week. And thank all you guys for listening. I've been trying very hard in the past few weeks to really put out shows with people who can give a different perspective. And I know from some of the letters that I've gotten from you that you appreciate that as well. I'm going to keep trying to do that. And we're going to keep the faith and keep being encouraged and looking at the good and just sending prayers for speedy recovery to all the injured, for no more deaths on the battlefield, and for Hamas and the Hezbollah and the Iranian leadership and the Houthis and all those really bad guys who are messing with the Jews and messing with all good people everywhere. This is not just our problem, to somehow not be able to do so anymore, and I don't care how that happens. So Eve Harow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. Thank you to everyone for listening. And I hope you are well wherever you are and that I will be back next week. Take care, everybody, and goodbye for now.